topic for us this morning is about what are the challenges facing liberals and liberalism in Southeast Asia. Again, it's a broad spectrum topic, and it will provide the context for our more localized discussion later on in the day. I'm sorry for people at the back. I was at the back just now, and I must admit that it's very difficult to see people who are talking from here. We really should have a raised platform, but I'm so sorry about that. We don't have that today. But let's hope the discussion will be good. The format is going to be very straightforward. What time do we have to finish, Reza? Since an hour. Okay, we'll try to finish by 11:30. So we'll try to catch up with time. So let's try to have presentation or speeches from you for 7 to 10 minutes maximum, so that we can then go into discussion with the audience. Okay, let me invite Kun Kasit first.
Thank you very much. I said a lot already, but just to touch a bit within the context of the Southeast Asia and ASEAN community, that at the moment we have Brunei as absolute monarchy with more and more of the religious overtone to the introduction of the Sharia law. In spite of the fact that Brunei is a member of the ASEAN community and a signature to the ASEAN Charter. And I think inside all the provisions of the ASEAN Charter, there's so many words about people participation, individualism, human rights, or even the word of democracy. And at the same time, ASEAN community, as of the year 2009, had already set up the ASEAN Human Rights Commission. Then we have the Philippines and Indonesia, blossoming democracy. Singapore has very strong internal security law, so does Malaysia. Thailand at the moment, military government. And I think in Cambodia, more or less elected one-man rule. Vietnam and Laos still very much of a communist-led political system. I think Myanmar looks good, but moving back again, not only the continued presence of the military establishment, but more religious and ethnic conservatism, reactionary. So the challenges for the whole of Southeast Asia is how to move liberal thinking forward. And I think it depends on the wish, the aspiration of the respective peoples in Southeast Asia, that the people must fight for their own freedom, for their own ownership of the country. And I think we have seen good example in Cambodia through the endless activities and fight of Som Rangsi, 9 years in exile, coming back. And at the last elections, if he was not cheated, I think his party more or less won. And he keeps on fighting. And he was being, I think, assisted by the youth to the mobile phone, social network, and so on. So in that sense, then we have to ask, then what happened to the youths in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, Philippines, Indonesia, and so on? I think the Cambodian youths have shown the example of wanting to have a better life in a more of the open environment. And the people in general would have to be more ambitious. And when I say the people, I would like to see much more of the exertion of the private sector. Because in ASEAN country, more or less the economies are being run by the private sector. In Thailand, it's almost 100%. Only a few state enterprises, but they are mostly in the utilities, water supply, electricity, and so on. And we only have maybe 2 functional state enterprise that is doing commercial business, namely the Petroleum Authority of Thailand and the Thai International Airways. But the rest are more or less run by private sector. And they have been operating under an open market economy democratic system. But they have not exerted themselves onto whatever government to have a fairer rules, clear-cut rules, and not to have the rules that depend very much on discretionary power of the bureaucrats, and so on. So I think in short, the people would have to come out to say that what they want is an open society. The intellectuals have to come out more, the private sector will have to come out more, and hopefully the youth will spend less time on materialistic well-being and think more about the society at large. And hopefully the international community, especially the United Nations, which just celebrated the UN International Democracy Day just a few days ago. But I think the United Nations cannot only do anything about democracy only on the UN International Democracy Day. It's only one day out of 365. So the various UN units on democracy would have to come out more and more in promoting democracy and networking with institutions like CAL that I mentioned, and the other one is the Community of Democracies based in Warsaw, Poland. Have to work more and more with the interfaith dialogue and I think civilization conference and so on. All of this in order to enhance the basic individual human rights and a more participatory politics. And hopefully the various civil society in each of the country will work more and more on the promotion of democracies and networking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kun Kasit. Maybe we should just go straight to Razeen.
Thank you, Wan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Selamat pagi. I have 3 points to make in what might sound a little abstract. This is not going to be policy wonkish comments. It's quite a different approach I'm taking. And my 3 points are firstly about liberalism as a set of ideas outside the West broadly, not just in this region. Secondly, about liberalism in practice. And third, where do we go from here? There's a famous quote from Keynes, which I don't remember correctly, but it goes something like this: madmen who hear voices in the air. He was thinking of Hitler. And more generally, leaders, whether they are right or they're wrong, are following the ideas of some defunct economist or academic scribbler. That's about the power of ideas. We have to face facts here. Ideas on how to organize human society collectively originated in the West, spread in the West, and then came to parts of the world outside the West through colonialism, through trade, through missionaries. Yes, there have been minority traditions of thought on how to organize human society outside the West, but the most powerful ideas have come from the West and still come from the West. That's true of collectivist ideas, socialism to communism overlapping with nationalism. It's also true of liberal ideas. But it's unfortunate that it's the collectivist ideas that have triumphed most of all outside the West. When it comes to liberalism, arguably it's political liberalism, liberal democracy, civic freedoms, that have had most traction outside the West as a set of ideas. Social liberalism, less so, things to do with family, work, sexual relations, gender. And economic liberalism, the freedom of the individual to produce and to consume, Adam Smith's natural liberty, also much less than political liberalism. Just by way of example, the renaissance of economic liberalism in the West that came with Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek never really translated outside the West as a set of ideas or ideology, apart from a few eccentrics like one in Malaysia and some people here and there. Rather, among the elite, ideology in this part of the world and elsewhere out of the West was a combination of the big men in charge having collectivist ideas and paternalistic ideas, which chime with Kun Kasit's narrative about patron-client relations, and then this ideology of so-called pragmatism, which one hears in Singapore and around the region. We do whatever works. We don't believe in ideas and ideology. That, I think, has been more the norm. Singapore, you have the establishment which defends the status quo in power, but what about the opposition? The opposition does talk about political liberalism, it talks about social liberalism, but on the economy, the opposition is more interventionist than the government. They're a mild form of European social democracy. In other words, economic liberalism doesn't really get a shout in Singapore, much less so here in Malaysia. When on my last visit, I debated Charles Santiago of the DAP on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, I guess that Charles Santiago and I would have a lot in common when it comes to political and social liberalism, but on economic issues, we're at opposite ends of the spectrum. That's just by way of example. So to sum up this story, liberals, of course, are here to defend liberalism in the round, a connection of political, social, and economic liberalism, which can be combined in Sir Karl Popper's term, the open society. And this connection is perhaps best expressed in the mid-19th century by John Stuart Mill. That outside the West still does not translate. You might find it among the yearnings of ordinary people in some kind of inchoate, inarticulate way, but not among the elites. What about liberalism in practice? This is where I'm somewhat more optimistic because there is a paradox here. Liberalism in practice has actually spread much more outside the West than liberalism in theory. And let me explain it this way. Yes, it's true. Liberalism is still much more entrenched in the West in the round than it is outside the West. All the major indices show that. The history of the last millennium outside the West has largely been that of predatory states. Predatory states were limited and then reversed in the late Middle Ages and the beginnings of modernity in the West, which is why the West had a commercial revolution, then an agricultural revolution, then an industrial revolution, then a post-industrial revolution. All of that happened much later and in much attenuated form outside the West. But we can still point to pockets of liberal expansion, especially economic liberalism, outside the West. There was a golden age of Indian Ocean commerce, and also in Southeast Asia, before Portuguese colonization in this part of the world, which I like to wax lyrical on, but I don't have time here. It was all about city-states, including Malacca, the precursor to modern Singapore. The East Asian miracle after 1945 was very much about the expansion of economic freedom, despite intervention here and there. Globalization post-1980, with the opening up of China, Russia, Brazil, India, and also the spurt of liberalization in Southeast Asia, was also very much about the expansion of economic freedom. And as a result of that, as a result of taking government interventions away, you have the animal spirits of entrepreneurs and ordinary people unleashed across the region and beyond. And that shows particularly with the hard-working, aspiring younger generation. The reason for all that is, I think, less to do with the persuasion of ideas and more to do with a kind of pragmatic adaptation to seeing that previous policies have failed and we have to try and do something different, so we copy, which is a good thing. My third and last point is, where do we go from here? Now, you might get the impression from what I've been saying so far that we can be sanguine, that we don't need to engage in the persuasion of ideas because Asians are pragmatic, they will become more liberal in practice, beginning with the economy. That, I think, is far too complacent a view, and I fully agree with Kun Kasit's call to activism in terms of persuading through ideas. Why? Because political liberalism can easily be reversed in practice, as we've seen in Thailand. Social liberalism has always been like a fragile bamboo, and when the wind blows too hard, the bamboo blows over. Especially with fundamentalist Islam and, as we see, fundamentalist Buddhism. In Myanmar, I've seen it also in my native Sri Lanka. I'm half Sri Lankan, by the way. And on the economic front, it's very easy to copy the fads from the West, also when they are wrong, when they are illiberal, as we have seen in the wake of the GFC, when one's governing ideology is pragmatism, doing whatever works. In this sense, we in Asia and elsewhere are what V.S. Naipaul calls mimic men. It's the title of one of his books. We're very good at mimicking things that come out of the West when they are right and when they are wrong. That's what happens when you don't have a compass. Hence the importance of ideas and setting the right ideas. I tend to prioritize economic liberalism. That's my background. I also believe that that's the case because it's weaker than political liberalism, and also perhaps the most important in terms of the ordinary lives of ordinary people. And economic liberalism leading to a market society plugged into the world is perhaps most important as the foundation for political and social liberalism. In that sense, we have to defend liberalism in the round, but there's a quote, I will end here, from John Stuart Mill that I very much like. He says, "The word in season does much to decide the result." Now, the implication of that is that ideas are important, the word, but so is the season. You have to be pragmatic and practical about marrying the ideology with practice and pragmatism, and that, very broadly speaking, I think is the way we should try to move forward. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Razeen. It's really interesting, I think, to find that Kun Kasit just now mentioned how there's hope in the youth and how the Cambodian youth are setting the example. I think the Malaysian youth are quickly following suit as well. And when Razeen mentioned about how we are very good at copying both the good things and the bad things coming from the West, but I think coming from everywhere as well. And the importance of having this compass to guide us. Let's now move on to Dr. Oiki Beng.
Thank you, Wan. Good morning, everybody. First, let me thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity, or to be frank, for forcing me into a situation where I've had, over the last couple of months, had to revisit whatever I remember about liberalism and political ideology. A sinologist is a historian, by the way, so that's more or less where I'm coming from. Well, okay, let me approach this in my own special way. I'll frame my reasoning about liberalism and in fact about politics in general in Malaysia by bringing in a few dichotomies. Many of them already mentioned. First, of course, is the individual versus the state or society. The private sector versus the public sector, nation building versus state building, I think is an important dichotomy. And then, since we live in the age of globalization and regionalization, the national versus the international. I think all these play in because of historical trends. And in studying only the ideas, I don't think we can look away from historical trends. Having mentioned all these dichotomies, there is, after listing them, an underlying dichotomy here of what's inside and what's outside. It's defining what one is in order to relate it to what the other one is. So I think if we're talking about the individual and then about the nation, I suppose we're talking about the integrity of the individual and also the sovereignty of the nation, and how these actors try to protect that. Now, at the individual level, being liberal is a way of relating to others, isn't it? It's a social context. It is to allow others their freedom. That's being liberal. So it means to allow, to tolerate, and more sharply, to accept that something is none of my business as well. Now here, perhaps I should ad-lib a bit in response to what Professor Corners was saying this morning about the Malay language not having a word like liberalism. And of course, if it's an ism we're looking for, then no. But I tend to think in Nusantara, in Southeast Asia, that people here, perhaps like bamboos, are rather liberal people. So if I may venture, I'm not Malay, but I may venture, a word to signify what the Malay attitude is where liberalism is concerned is ta'apaism, you know. It's an allow. We like to use it as a way of criticizing the Malays for not taking a stand. But I think it's really important. It defines a lot of Nusantara culture, I think. I think the Malay community at the moment is getting a raw deal because something else is trying to define them. A tak bolehism, if you like. There's a punitive culture coming in trying to redefine the Malay, and I think traditionally and historically that is not Malay culture. So there is a given liberal attitude baked into it. Not an ism as such, but still. Yeah, so much at the individual level. But historically, I would also say that what we're discussing here is against a backdrop of Asian societies trying to reorganize themselves following the Cold War, following colonialism. So that is a very slow process. That is a very painful process, and I think that process, if we look at it, would explain many of the disappointments that have been mentioned today of things looking as if they're going forward, and then suddenly they don't. They suddenly move backwards overnight, you know, as if nothing really sits very deeply. But yet we know that his societies don't work like that. Societies have very deep roots. So perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. And as a historian, I would then look at my third dichotomy, which is nation building versus state building. And I think that's what Asian societies are caught up in. And we haven't done that very long. 50 years for most countries, for China, maybe 150 years. They're caught up in that. Now, when we say nation building or state building, the word building is so positive, right? We're building something, but of course we're destroying something. And it's that destroying and building that's going on. And sometimes we destroy the wrong thing, and then we can't get it back and whatnot, you know. So it's a difficult time for Asian societies, I think, because we are talking about huge global and historical processes that for several centuries, I would think, since the global age has been trying to redefine, I suppose, all sorts of social organization. So modernization, globalization, nation building, state building, all this are about defining what's inside, what's outside. So when I say all this, where does liberalism lie in all this? I think part of country building, I like to use that as a neutral term. We take the case of Malaysia, right? We see in Malaysian history, most of you know Malaysian history. First, there was the defining of physical borders, because if you don't have that entity, you can't be building anything, liberalism or not. That's part of what the nation or state building process is. So you look at Malaysian history, we've had few periods now where the physical boundaries were not decided, right? So already from Malayan Union onwards, when the Strait Settlements was broken up, you had changes of boundaries. 1957, you had changes, Federation of Malaysia. And then you have the Federation of Malaysia, right? 1.0, 1963. And then you have Federation of Malaysia 2.0, 1965. And our boundaries keep changing. These are all very recent things. So we are talking about nation-building processes that are still trying to find its right footing. And also, in line with that, deciding what's inside and outside, we have the human boundaries. And we see in Malaysian history throughout the 40s and 50s, it was all about who's in and who's out, right? Are we to give citizenship to the non-Malays, and according to what principle, and who should be in, who should be out? And that keeps going. It's still going on today, and a lot of our discussion and our discourses are still about that, which also explains in trying to draw a line between in and out, we have Malay ethnocentrism drawing a double line. So you have so the Malay community connects itself to the indigenous peoples and call themselves Bumiputra, and then in order to draw even a deeper line. So for Malaysia, the inside and outside actually is layered. And that of course affects how nation building and how Malaysians are supposed to understand themselves. And then third, we have perhaps the most important one, what are the conceptual boundaries for social national cohesion? And we can't even come to the point where we talk about ideology in Malaysia, because we still haven't decided how we are to get our people to think that they are one and the same. And that's a contest that keeps going on, and it will keep going on for quite a while yet, I think. Now let me talk more about nation. I've got 2 minutes left, but nation building and state building. And if I may, I quickly jump to Singapore. I'll use Singapore as a case because Singapore is quite an extreme case, really. And yet, strangely enough, for the Nusantara area, I think where the nation-state ideal has come in, and we are all nation states now, that Singapore, despite that, seems to function more in line with tradition. As Razeen properly said, the Malacca was a sort of predecessor to Singapore, because that's how the Nusantara works. You work through city-states. And today, Singapore is a nation-state, a city-state, a global city. It can't decide what it is, but we sort of know what it's out to get. But Singapore is easy to look at and understand and see as a model, because it is so small, right? And it's an island and whatnot. And also the government there is so rational in what it does, for better or worse. And when nation building and state building are concerned, I would take Singapore as the epitome of state building. They build the state. They build the institutions. They go for the institutions. And we know from the start, 1959 already onwards, that they were going to build institutions based on economic needs. So the primacy of economics is what defines Singapore. And all the institutions, the first ones, the EDB, the HDB, they were all done to handle economic problems. Now, you don't handle economic problems any which way. What was special here, Singapore being an island state and being part of the Nusantara tradition, was trade, right? So you had to build state institutions that were meant to help trade, that was meant to build up your economy. And that is the basic logic. And Singapore has built itself very much as a state building project. And I think to some extent why this is so important is that even China seems to be looking at that and thinking, here are things we can learn, and we will build our institutions after Maoism as institutions that are meant for economic growth, and in what way? Meant for international trade. And it's still a process that's ongoing. They don't know always exactly what they're doing. So I think it's a back and forth that's happening. I'm running out of time, so I better jump a bit. When it comes to Malaysia, then I think, just in contrast, I think it's the primacy of nationhood that has taken over, and I think I've talked about that, so I don't need to elaborate. And last point, the national and the international. I think whether we're liberals or not, going forward, we have to consider regionalism. It is a force that is part of the nationalism of the region. There's no great difference. So I think liberalism, or the freedom of the individual and how states are supposed to act, will be very much defined going forward by regional processes. Where economic liberalism is concerned, we do see that Singapore and Malaysia build their economy on GLCs to a very large extent. And one reason for this would, of course, be that being small and new countries, you have to, accumulate your resources to compete with MNCs and whatnot. And so if we see all this happening on the global stage, it becomes unclear what is public and what is private, which is quite a challenge to traditional conceptions of liberalism, economic liberalism. Is a state acting as a GLC on the global market a public institution or a private one? Are MNCs necessarily private? Things like that. I think I'll have to stop there and allow for the discussion. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. But thank you, Dr. Beng. The point that you raised, I think, is a very good point to end the presentations with, because you more or less mentioned that there is this thing called economic liberalism, and Razeen hinted at that as well. And there is also the other side, which is the more socially liberal ideas. So let me kick off the discussion by asking maybe one or two questions, and then we open up to the floor. Is there a difference between social liberalism and economic liberalism, or is this the same thing? How will you address this? Can you be a liberal by only being a social liberal and not an economic liberal? How will you deal with these two different things? Yeah. Anyone, please.
Well, let me have a stab at it. I think they're all connected, but different liberals can have different emphases and different combinations. So there are some economic liberals who are perhaps not political liberals down the line when it comes to modern liberal democracy. Some of them may be socially liberal or libertarian, but some may be socially conservative. So you do have, I think it's more difficult to have a combination of liberalism and social democracy, because social democracy ultimately is a derivation of collectivism, of something organized from the top to engineer certain outcomes, right? Whereas conservatism, at least in many of its traditions, can be more organic and spontaneous. And there is perhaps a better connection there between liberalism in terms of the primacy of the individual and his or her freedom, and the wonderful phrase from Tocqueville, habits of the heart. The habits of the heart that arise through social evolution, that result in customs and traditions. Now, some of them might be highly illiberal. That's what Kasit talked about, among other things, during his talk. But there are other elements that could indeed be liberal. I find myself, broadly speaking, having a combination of liberalism and conservatism. I have friends who are more conservative than liberal. I would think of myself as more liberal than conservative. But I would, in terms of my own beliefs, almost utter the two in the same breath, in that I believe in individual freedom, but I don't believe in individual freedom as a kind of hyper-rationalist exercise that destroys everything that's gone before it in this or that society, because I think that's usually a recipe for a kind of totalitarian slippery slope. You try and create heaven on earth, you end up creating hell. Rather, I think it's always helpful to find what is there in a pre-existing tradition including religion, including all sorts of customs, that has liberal possibilities, and work with that grain to produce something that evolves, rather than think of a revolutionary moment, because revolutions almost always end up in destruction and despair. Is my roundabout answer to your question.
May I? Yeah. Let me answer it this way. I'm more a philosophical anarchist, so it's not a liberal. So it's hard for me to think in those terms. But let me answer you by bringing in the individual versus power, right? So I look at it as a coercion going on. And if I continue from where I laid off, we live in a time of statism. That's nation building and whatnot. And so we have a problem of democracy being the other trend, as it were, pushing from below. So social liberalism I would use, instead of saying liberalism, I would say the democratic impulse, if you like, coming from below, and then the state having to configure all this in some ways. So social liberalism for me then, at the individual level, would be how do you negotiate the historically informed coercive system that's going on. So if I continue to answer that by going back to what I said about regionalism, what is new today seems to be the high rate of mobility of people, of everything, of capital, of what have you. And that, for those who are able to be mobile, allows for a certain freedom, a certain liberalism, if you like, at that level, you know. And I think over time, states need this mobility. It has to take into account, it has to take advantage of this mobility, which is, well, enter Singapore, right? That's what Singapore is about. So I think that at that level, states do compete with each other. So if we're talking about liberalism, we talk about social liberalism, economic liberalism, there is liberalism at the state level. The states are fighting each other. They're trying to, Vietnam is doing very well at the moment, which means Malaysia is not. You know, that you're competing for the same, competing for talent, competing for companies and whatnot. And at the individual level, people can make use of that as for their own freedom and their own well-being, for the welfare of their family. So my approach would be more from that angle, really, more than ideational.
It's a very difficult question. I start with the economic liberalism. I think the furtherance of it should be like this, that all the professional associations should be self-regulating. Architecture association, the hairdresser association, they should be able to what you call control themselves, regulate themselves, and so on, instead of having to register at the Ministry of Commerce or Justice or Finance and so on. For furtherance of economic liberalism is for the professionals and so on to be able to look after their own and so on, and then the state should be only to oversee the regulation and the fairness, I think, between the professional associations and the consumers. Okay, let's leave it to that. On the social liberalism, I just want to cite the example of Switzerland, that more and more in Switzerland there is the practice of direct democracy. A month ago, I was in Switzerland to attend a meeting. But on Sunday, the people have to go to the poll to cast vote on 4 issues on a referendum. And I think when you said about social liberalism is the fact that instead of having the usual indirect democracy of representation through parliament, I think Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg, and so on, small country, of course, or Singapore, Hong Kong, city-state, can move into the direction of more direct participation. That would be one. Second, in the larger country, for social liberalism to take place is the question of the natural resources. What would be the formula of the income to be derived from the extraction of the natural resources? I think in Indonesia, generally it is 70% to Jakarta, 30% to each of the province. But the province of Papua and Aceh are special cases. So the allocation is in reverse. Aceh gets 70% if the oil or gas is found. Papua also. And the central government in Jakarta get 30%. And in that sense, I think it's a more fairer distribution of the resources and more sort of a social ownership and participation. So 2 points, I think, about Indonesia and about Switzerland in terms of more of the social liberalism pertaining or related to the utilization of the resources. Thank you.
Okay. Good. Razeen, before you make your point, can I just ask quickly if there's any questions from the audience? Please just raise your hand, and there are mics on the aisles. No? Yes, please. Yes, there's a mic there at the back, if you don't mind. Just behind you.
Thank you. My name is Moderator. I'm from Pelita Harapan University in Indonesia. My question is about, is it possible, do you think that is it possible to apply liberalist view in a country like Indonesia due to some like, how to say, like Muslim extremists there, and also we have like limitation in our constitution to the right of people, like freedom of religion, for example. We have limitation in our constitution. The question is it possible to apply a liberalist view, especially in Indonesia? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question? Maybe we can take another one before I open up. Yes, please, at the back.
Hello, my name is Jamal Khan. I'd just like to clarify with the panel. There are three different distinct areas here of liberalism: political, economic, and social. I think more this is directed towards Dr. Razeen. Would you agree that political liberalism is basically saying that we have a multi-party democracy within the country? Economic liberalism is basically a free market, and social liberalism is basically being guided by something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, I ask this question because, to me, simply put, social liberalism is very easy to define. Do you support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? You know, other UN declarations that your country is a party to. That's my definition of social liberalism. Economic liberalism is also easy to define, but it's optional. Every country can decide you want to be socialist, less free market, more free market. That's not such a proposition whereby you must have this or that. I mean, you could be Keynesian, you could be monetarist or whatever it is. So that's more determined by the government of the day. So that's not a prerequisite, I think, to a free economy, because that can be decided by the people when they elect the government. Of course, politics, the political liberalism is a prerequisite, multi-party representation within any country. So I would say political liberalism and social liberalism are very important for any country, whereas the economic liberalism depends on who's the government of the day. Would the panel tend to agree or disagree with that?
Interesting question. I've not met you for quite a while, Jamal. So anyway, so is it okay to be 2/3 liberal and 1/3 not? So is that iman yang cukup kuat atau tidak lagi? So okay, so how do we handle this?
On the first question about Indonesia, I think the fact that you have the ideology or the principle of the Pancasila introduced by the former President Sukarno, I think that is very, very democratic, very liberal in the sense that it gives Indonesia an inclusive and a tolerant society, acceptance of the differences. But the differences must live in harmony and together. And from then on, I think liberalism or liberal practices could be implemented based on that Pancasila. So in that sense, it's also avoid or prevent any types of fundamentalism or extreme political Islam. That is the first point. Second one is that on this 2/3 thing, no, it has to be economic liberal, not any government coming in. And then I would like to cite the example of Thailand, that elected government, you know, from the political liberalism, social liberalism, and then they came in and then they started to have a populist policy measure, and then that destroyed the country. You have to have economic liberalism in the sense of I think, not the government controlled, not the government intervention, and not the state enterprises competing with the private sector and so on. The role of the state or the government is to ensure fair competition and to ensure the fairness between the producers and the consumers. State must function as a regulator and mediator and to ensure fair treatment of all the stakeholders, but they cannot become unto themselves a sort of an authoritarian or guided economic entity. Thank you.
Got 2 points to make. One in response to the question posed by the gentleman at the back, but the first really to follow on from Kun Kasit's previous comments about Switzerland. And it strikes me that the paragons of liberalism in the world today and in the world of yesteryear are a combination of city-states and small countries with small economies that are open and highly exposed to the world, which is where Switzerland comes into play. I recently had to do an essay for a Swiss think tank entitled Why Switzerland? They asked a number of foreigners to answer this question. And I said, I'm fond of Switzerland from my interrailing days back in the 1980s, 30 years ago, because of its combination of liberalism and conservatism. So if you compare it with, if this is relative, if you compare it with other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, Switzerland has a high degree of political freedom and economic freedom, and it has the social freedoms one expects of a Western liberal democracy. But it is also a country that's come together in a highly evolutionary way through a combination of all sorts of conservatisms, which are rooted to place, to culture, to religion, to language, and so on. And you have a combination of the two. I added why despite my fondness for Switzerland, why I wouldn't like to live in Switzerland, and this relates to the conservatism of Switzerland. In some places you can't flush your toilet after 10 o'clock at night, and you can't have a shower before a certain time in the morning, and you have to share your washing machine with other people in your apartment block. As a liberal, I don't approve of all that. And then think of the paragons of, well, there's only one city-state left in the world today that's also a nation-state, and that's Singapore. I mean, Hong Kong isn't a nation-state, although it is a city-state. But if you take Hong Kong and Singapore, which are the successors to the Venices, Dubrovniks, Malaccas, Macassars, Calicut's of this world, you also see much more economic freedom than you do in other parts of the world, notwithstanding the GLCs and the Temasecs and the GICs and the CPFs of Singapore. It's a very easy place to live and to do business. And the main reason for that, perhaps the determining reason, is because of the discipline of globalization. These are places that are so exposed to the world is their lifeblood, that it disciplines them when they go in a wrong direction. So you ask yourself, why has Singapore done so many things so successfully right, even while it's lacked the liberal democratic checks and balances of the West? Yes, it's been very lucky in having an extraordinary first generation of leaders, and then the institutions put in place to outlast them. But none of that would have probably happened, and Singapore would probably have gone way off the rails much earlier, if not for being so plugged into the global economy, and much more so than Malaysia, even though Malaysia is so plugged in. And that's an element of historical continuity, because you can point to the liberalism in places like Malacca going back 5 centuries, including a fairly tolerant government, religious toleration, free trade pretty much, pretty secure foreign property rights, including for foreigners. All of that because it was on the sea and open to all those Arab dhows and others sailing back and forth and trading. The second point, I think it's a very important question, because we have to clear our minds to answer the question, what does liberalism mean for us in its different aspects? Because as we see, it is multifaceted. So political liberalism, what does that mean to me? It doesn't mean multi-party democracy, period. That's, if you like, the older Greek version of liberalism, what Benjamin Constant called the liberty of the ancients. It's democracy. Democracy is not liberalism on its own. Liberalism in the modern sense, from John Locke onwards, and perhaps best embodied in the Federalist Papers of Hamilton and Madison, what infused the US Constitution, is democracy with checks and balances, but checks and balances above all, especially through delegation and representation, to protect the liberty of the individual. That to me is political liberalism. Economic liberalism is perhaps more straightforward. Yes, it's synonymous with the free market under the rule of law. That's the crucial caveat. It's not the law of the jungle. And social liberalism to me is certainly not the UN Declaration of Human Rights. I am instinctively suspicious of any declaration coming out of the United Nations. That includes the Declaration of Human Rights, because what you have is a long list of rights chatter that gets ever longer, much of it highly illiberal. And that takes one away from the essential freedom of the individual without adding, the right to employment, the right to education, and so on and so forth, all of which are good things to be wished for, but which invite highly illiberal interventions in order to engineer certain outcomes. In other words, what goes into a lot of these declarations is actually something that comes more from collectivist ideology than it does from liberalism.
Okay, I'll try to answer both the questioners together. I think Razeen's answer was a very good one. I don't know how I can add to that other than to supplement it perhaps by saying that in the Asian context, to my mind, there's the liberal state is a paradox. It's a liberal state, that means it's a weak state, right? So in the Indonesian context, a liberal state comes after a very illiberal state. When that state breaks down, you have something else, and we recognize that as a rather liberal state. Is it merely a weak state? But if I connect the three then, social liberalism, economic liberalism, and political liberalism, I think Razeen's answer was a very good one. But I would like to add the point of the society as a zone of eternal conflict, if you like. So somehow we have to have peace, but within a conflict-ridden kind of context. So, unity in diversity, conflict in harmony, I think that's sort of what we try to balance ourselves at. I think of course, political liberalism as defined by Locke, I think that's a good one, where you actually come up with an ideology and this is how you should do it. But I think more in practical terms, it's more a pushing back of state power. State power seen, maybe I'm unfair, but seen as basically coercive. And so it has to be pushed back. So that's where democracy becomes important. I mean, real democracy in the sense that it's the people speaking out and pushing back and taking from the state's demand that everybody is loyal only to it, while society wants to be loyal to many things, to the family, to whatever, right? While the state wants to break that up and let all loyalty come up to it. So it's an eternal struggle, I think. So in that sense, I would think the liberal state, outside of the ideology, like from people like John Locke, is actually a weakened state, weakened by society, and it has to be liberal to the extent that because of economic and social forces, forcing it to be that.
But surely, we really need to stop very soon. But surely there's a difference between the state and the government, where the state can include society and that they can be strong, because within a liberal environment, the society should be strong, the individuals should be strong, rather. And at the same time, the government could be weaker in the sense that they cannot simply coerce the citizens to do other things. So I think we really need to stop. So I think what we can conclude from this discussion is simply that the struggle to further define what liberalism is a continuous one, especially in this part of the world. I think the concept itself, I don't think is alien to us. It's interesting that when Beng mentioned this tak apa-ism, which in a sense is quite a liberal attitude, right? Tak apalah, that one, we leave it to, you want to do it, I am not interfering with what you want to do. There's a Malay proverb on jangan jaga tepi kain orang, don't get too involved in other people's lives. So I think the concept is not an alien one, but when it comes to systematically defining what the concept actually means, then it's a challenge, because we are more or less discussing something that is perceived to be quite alien, even though in practice, there was a mention just now about how there's liberalism in theory and liberalism in practice, whereas in practice, we may be practicing it on daily life anyway. I really appreciate when Razeen mentioned about this, we're not necessarily saying social liberals or liberals generally would agree with the UN Declaration of Human Rights and any other declarations. I think that is quite an important thing to understand, because liberals generally, in fact, many liberals, most of the liberals, if not all of the liberals I have met at the international circle, they would be very skeptical of declarations coming up from the UN, even the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. If you go one by one, as Razeen was saying just now, some of them are not that liberal anyway. The thing that I quite like to discuss is on the education part, but I'm not going to go into details of that. I think that sets the scene for further discussion. We're going to have some very topical issues to discuss: liberalism and faith, liberalism and national identity, and economic liberalism at the end. So let's have a good conversation after this with all the backgrounds that have been provided over the last two sessions. And in the meantime, let us give a round of applause to all the speakers.